I'll also point out to you, by the way, that because I'm from Auburn, Alabama, which seems to, the university seems to have the same colors that you folks have, Auburn is right between two airports, Birmingham and Atlanta. They're both about 2 hours away. So going anywhere is an ordeal. Plus, if you go to Atlanta, which I do, you're moving into another time zone. So you're moving ahead an hour. So pretty much if you want to go anywhere and you're leaving in the morning, you got to leave at about 2 a.m. basically. So I last night I actually did not sleep at all. So I've been awake, just been awake. So I don't even remember the last time I slept. I don't know, three days ago. I don't know what it was. But somehow here I am still standing. So if I'm able to do this coherently and what I say more or less makes sense, it's all the more impressive, okay, because for the lack of sleep. Well, let me begin with this. Most of you have probably not heard of Gunnar Myrdal. It's probably a good thing. Gunnar Myrdal won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974 in tandem with F.A. Hayek. Now that's interesting because Myrdal was very much a socialist and Hayek was a free market economist. And Hayek was, in large part, an uncompromising free market economist, so it seems as if the Nobel Committee decided, we want to honor Hayek, but gee, he's so free market, we can't just honor Hayek. We'll try to balance it out by honoring somebody who teaches the exact opposite of what Hayek teaches, which is why it's sometimes been the butt of jokes that economics is the only discipline for which two people teaching exactly the opposite thing can win the Nobel Prize in the same year. Well, Gunnar Myrdal was a socialist who believed in large part in central planning of the economy. And half a century ago, exactly half a century ago, Myrdal wrote this. He said, "The special advisors to underdeveloped countries who have taken the time and trouble to acquaint themselves with the problem, no matter who they are, all recommend central planning as the first condition of progress." That, in effect, means the government running the economy. And this was the mainstream view, that if the third world, the underdeveloped countries, are going to be developed, it's going to have to take place by means of massive government planning over those economies. Now, there were a few critics of this view, but they could have fit into a phone booth. However, today, if you were to ask economists about this, those who still say that central planning is the way for the less developed countries to go, well, those economists could basically fit into a phone booth. There has been a sea change in our thinking. Now, we see a lot of public protests today against something called globalization. These protests, by and large, occur in the prosperous West. And they denounce free trade and the mobility of capital as instruments of exploitation and oppression. Peter Bauer, who was a great development economist, used to say that if that were true, if free trade and the mobility of capital were really instruments of exploitation and oppression, then we should find the greatest prosperity among those third world countries that have the fewest economic connections with the West, and those places in the world that are completely isolated and have no trade, and therefore suffer from none of this alleged exploitation, those should be paradise on earth. Well, needless to say, this is not even close to the reality of the situation, and most serious observers know that. Today, practically everyone agrees that some kind of market economy is essential if the less developed countries are ever to mature to developed status. Now, there are differences of opinion. And it's true that there are increasingly some voices that are once again starting to call for state-led development. But the terms of the debate have nevertheless shifted overall. And as globalization has proceeded, the subject of the market economy has attracted more and more attention, with friend and foe alike seeking to understand the implications of the creation of a truly global marketplace. Now, one of the virtues of the free market, and the reason that it makes possible the peaceful interaction of so many different diverse types of peoples, is that it demands of its participants only that they observe a relatively few basic principles, among them honesty, the sanctity of contracts, and respect for private property. But I want to go further than this. I want to suggest that not only that the market system, of its very nature, leads to rising standards of living for everyone, but also that morality and the market, so often portrayed as antagonists, are in fact mutually reinforcing. It isn't merely that the market requires certain moral attributes in order to function properly. The market itself encourages moral behavior. Now, it takes little imagination to surmise how critics of the market would respond to this claim. What, am I crazy? Don't I know that the market encourages greed and competition and rivalrousness and discord? Doesn't it urge people to think only of themselves and accumulating wealth and not think of any other concern? Well, it is true that human beings do think about their own well-being, and they do think about the well-being of those close to them. This is not a revolutionary discovery. The point is that no matter what economic system you have, this fact of human nature exists and expresses itself. It expresses itself, however, in different ways, depending on the types of economies you have. It isn't that if you have a communist economy, people don't care about themselves anymore and they just selflessly work for the common good. They still have this self-interest. It just expresses itself differently. Now, under the communist system, it happens to be the case that communist apparatchiks working in communist governments were not actually selfless devotees of the common good. They were not working day and night on behalf of the people. In fact, they too wanted to increase their own well-being. This is a natural attribute of the human condition. But under communism, if you want to increase your well-being and you work in the communist system, your well-being comes at the expense of everybody else. That's the difference between that system and the market. Under a free market, your well-being comes from serving your fellow man. You have to do something that your fellow man finds valuable. Whereas under the communist system, typically, the apparatchiks who ruled over people, well, they had all kinds of fancy cars and yachts and whatever, but they didn't get those things because they were really skilled at pleasing their fellow man. They got them by looting their fellow man. There's an American reporter named Hendrik Smith who traveled around Russia in 1990. And he said, traveling around the country, I came to see the great mass of Soviets as protagonists in what I call the culture of envy. In this culture, corrosive animosity took root under the czars, in the deep-seated collectivism in Russian life, and then was cultivated by Leninist ideology. Now it has turned rancid under the misery of everyday living. And here's how Smith continues. He says, the Soviet ruling class, with their cushy cars, clinics, and country homes, are a natural enough target for the wrath of the little people. But what is ominous for Gorbachev's reforms is that this free-floating anger, the jealousy of the rank and file, often lights on anyone who rises above the crowd, anyone who works harder, gets ahead, and becomes better off, even if his gains are honestly earned. This hostility is a serious danger to the new entrepreneurs whom Gorbachev is trying to nurture. It is a deterrent to even modest initiative among ordinary people in factories or on farms. It freezes the vast majority into the immobility of conforming to the group. Now, under the Soviet system, so-called profiteers or black marketeers made it possible for people to live at a civilized material level. People, in effect, engaged in illegal transactions made it possible for their fellow man to get the goods they needed. Now, you would think that in a situation like that, people would sort of have a grudging respect for people who worked on the black market, because after all, at least they could provide them with the goods they needed. But the actual effect appears to have been to poison the very idea of profit in the minds of many Russians, since they came to assume that anyone making a profit must be engaged in behavior that was somehow illegal, illicit, or underhanded. Now, the countless stories in the Soviet press, as late in the socialist experiment as the 1980s, about vandalism and attacks on small shops by those who resented the success of their fellow man, in Smith's words, bear witness to the powerful influence of decades of Leninist indoctrination. For the great masses of Soviet people, capitalism is still a dirty word, and the fact